3 weeks after Vanessa Caldwell, the white chief executive of Caldwell Provisions, dismissed him in front of the full boardroom, Marcus Webb, a black single father, spent his final dollar buying a rundown diner along the coast to start fresh with his young daughter Naomi, but on the very day he was repairing the kitchen, Vanessa arrived with an attorney, eyed him like someone who had already failed, and offered to buy the property back. Marcus declined, not yet knowing that the old diner would soon uncover a secret capable of toppling her entire company, and whether he could hold on to his dignity through it all became the heart of what followed. The 30th floor conference room carried the smell of scorched coffee and stale air, the sort of space where verdicts were reached long before anyone took a seat. Marcus had sat in that room countless times across 9 years, always holding a clipboard and a set of figures that mattered to him more than his own comfort. He served as quality assurance manager at Caldwell Provisions, the person who caught problems before they turned into headlines, and for 9 years that role had carried weight. On this particular morning it carried none. 6 executives surrounded the table, 5 of them white, all avoiding his gaze in that particular way people do when a decision has already been made and only the paperwork remains. Marcus had flagged a batch of tainted grain filler 3 weeks prior, sent the alert up the chain as he always did, and watched it vanish into silence. Now a recall was underway, a supplier lawsuit was forming, and somehow his name sat circled in red at the center of it. "We need to be clear, this wasn't a systemic failure," announced a vice president named Gerald Thorne, a man who in 9 years had never once gotten Marcus's first name right. This was a failure of judgment at the operational level. Marcus set his clipboard down slowly, deliberately, having learned long ago that anger in a room like this read as menace rather than heartbreak. "I sent 3 emails about that batch. I have the timestamps. I flagged it before it ever left the warehouse. We've reviewed the record," Thorne said without glancing up from his folder. "The record doesn't show that." The phrase lingered in the air, and Marcus understood precisely what was unfolding, having watched it happen to other black men in rooms just like this one, men who spoke up at the wrong moment and were suddenly reframed as reckless, as unstable, as untrustworthy even when the truth sat plainly before everyone. He had been labeled difficult before, called intense before. Today the term circulating quietly through careful corporate phrasing was saboteur. Vanessa Caldwell sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that likely cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, her pen gliding across a page without settling. She was 38, daughter of the company's founder, and had inherited a composure that made people confuse stillness with fairness. When she finally spoke, her voice stayed level. "Mr. Webb, effective today your position is terminated. Caldwell Provisions thanks you for your years of service." She signed a single page without lifting her eyes toward him, the pen scratching like a door closing. Nobody around the table moved to shake his hand. Marcus rose, buttoned his jacket, and looked directly at her until she finally glanced up, if only briefly. "You'll have to open that email again someday," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle, the way a man speaks when he has nothing left to lose by staying calm. Vanessa said nothing, returning her gaze to the folder, though something in her posture shifted as though his words had settled somewhere she couldn't quite reach. He left the building for the final time carrying a cardboard box holding 9 years of his life folded into a stapler, a coffee mug, and a photograph of his daughter that had been taped inside his locker. No one from Human Resources called to check on him, no one from his former team reached out, not from indifference but because they had families of their own and none wanted to become the next name circled in red. Severance would run dry quickly, and Marcus knew at the moment he signed the termination papers, so he wasted no time pretending stability still existed. He and Naomi lost their apartment near her old school within 2 weeks, the one with the window seat where she used to read, and relocated 2 hours down the coast to a town called Bayside Cove, where rent was cheaper and nobody yet knew his name. Naomi was 9, sharp-eyed and quiet in the way of children who read a room before they master long division. She didn't protest the move, simply packed her books from favorite to least favorite as always, and asked once from the back seat whether they'd ever return. "Not to that job," Marcus told her, eyes on the road rather than her face, "but we're going to build something better. I promise you that." He meant it more fully than he had ever meant anything, and that promise led him, exactly 3 weeks after walking out of Caldwell Provisions for good, to a boarded-up diner on a cracked stretch of coastal road beneath a faded sign reading Marguerites in peeling yellow paint. The realtor called it a fixer-upper, a generous description. The roof sagged at one corner, half the booths were missing cushions, and the neon sign hadn't lit in years, but the price was nearly nothing, low enough that Marcus could gather every remaining dollar of severance and savings, and something in the building's bones, the old counter, the wide windows overlooking the water, let him picture Naomi doing homework in a corner booth after school. He signed the papers on a Tuesday morning, his hands unsteady since leaving the notary's office, fully aware this was, without exaggeration, the last money he had in the world. There was no backup plan. If Marguerite's failed, no severance cushioned the fall, no safety net waited to catch him and his daughter, only the promise made in the car and a stubborn, quiet conviction that a man could still build something honest with his own hands even after the world decided he couldn't be trusted with anything. The labor started immediately and started alone. Marcus spent his early days in Bayside Cove tearing out rotted floorboards, scrubbing years of grease from the kitchen hood, and discovering through costly trial and error exactly how little he knew about plumbing. Naomi came by most afternoons after school, dropping her backpack at the door and taking charge of wiping down the old counter stools while her father wrestled with the walk-in cooler. She had appointed herself the diner's unofficial menu designer, filling a spiral notebook with colored pencil sketches of pancake stacks and burgers, sounding out words like griddle and syrup, while practicing her handwriting on a chalkboard leaned against the wall. It was on a Thursday morning, with Marcus halfway inside the old stove trying to relight a stubborn pilot light, that the bell above the front door rang for the first time since he'd purchased the place. Assuming it was the contractor he'd called about the roof, he didn't bother wiping the grease from his hands before standing to greet the visitor. It was Vanessa Caldwell. She stood just inside the doorway in a cream-colored coat entirely out of place in a room still thick with sawdust and old grease, flanked by a young assistant clutching a tablet and an older man in a suit who introduced himself coolly as legal counsel for Caldwell Provisions. For a moment nobody spoke, the silence stretching long enough that Marcus could hear the ocean through the cracked window behind the counter. "I didn't realize this was your project," Vanessa said finally, her gaze moving from his stained overalls to the water-damaged wall behind him, cataloging the diner the way she might catalog a failing subsidiary. The listing agent never mentioned a name. Would it have mattered? Marcus asked, wiping his hands on a rag from his belt, careful not to let the question sound accusatory even though it was. Vanessa didn't answer directly. Instead she explained, in the clipped, efficient tone Marcus remembered from 100 meetings, that Caldwell Provisions was in the early stages of acquiring the entire block for a chain of upscale coastal restaurants, part of a larger expansion the board had approved the previous quarter. "Marguerite's," she said, gesturing vaguely at the cracked plaster and sagging booths, "sits directly in the footprint of that plan." The lawyer stepped forward with a folder already prepared, sliding a single sheet across the sticky counter as though the entire visit had been choreographed before they walked through the door. The offer inside was nearly double what Marcus had paid for the property, along with what the lawyer termed a relocation stipend, a phrase that made it sound like a courtesy rather than what it truly was, an exit. "Consider it a clean way out," the lawyer said, tapping the page twice. "Given your current financial position, I'd think it's a generous offer." Marcus looked at the number, then at the lawyer, then at Vanessa, who studied a water stain on the ceiling as though it held more interest than the man before her. He understood with a clarity that settled cold in his chest exactly what they saw when they looked at him, a man who had already failed once, standing in a crumbling building, clearly in over his head, clearly a problem money could quietly erase before it became a story anyone had to explain. "I appreciate you making the trip," Marcus said, sliding the paper back without looking at it again, "but I'm not selling." Something flickered across Vanessa's face, not quite surprise, more mild disbelief, the look of someone facing an outcome absent from any of her projections. "Mr. Webb, I don't think you understand what you're taking on. This business destroys people, especially those without capital behind them. You have no reserve if something goes wrong, no investors, no safety net." "I'm aware," Marcus said. I signed the deed myself. Then you understand this could cost you everything you have left, Vanessa said, something almost like warning in her tone, though Marcus couldn't tell if it was genuine concern or condescension wearing concern's clothing. Either way, the underlying message was unmistakable. She didn't believe a man like him belonged on the other side of a negotiating table from Caldwell Provisions. Everything I have left is riding on this place, Marcus said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she'd entered. That's exactly why I'm not walking away. My daughter is 13 feet from where you're standing, coloring in a notebook, believing her father is building something real. I won't sell that out from under her because it's inconvenient to your expansion. The lawyer opened his mouth to add something, but Vanessa raised a hand slightly and he closed it again. For a moment she simply studied Marcus, the grease on his hands, the resolve on his face, and whatever calculation ran behind her eyes never resolved into words. She gathered her coat, told her assistant they were leaving, and walked out without another word. Marcus stood at the counter long after the car pulled away, listening to the ocean, listening to Naomi humming in the corner booth as she sketched another burger piled with too many toppings to be realistic. He understood, standing amid the wreckage of a diner he had no business believing he could save, that this had become more than rebuilding a business. It was about proving to himself, to his daughter, and to everyone who had ever looked at him and seen only what he'd lost, that a black man could be knocked down in one life and still rise whole in the next, entirely on his own terms. Vanessa's car had barely vanished down the coastal road before Marcus realized her visit marked not an ending but the start of a harder chapter. He returned to fixing the pilot light because there was nothing else to do, because Naomi was still coloring, because the diner still needed a working stove before serving a single plate of food, but something in him had hardened after that exchange, less fear than resolve settling into his bones. Over the following 2 weeks Marcus worked from before sunrise until long after Naomi had fallen asleep on the pull-out couch in their small rented apartment above a hardware store. He replaced rotted floorboards one by one, sanded the old counter until the grain showed through decades of grime, and taught himself through shaky instructional videos how to rewire half the diner's failing electrical system. Naomi helped where she could, her sketchbook filling with increasingly ambitious menu ideas: pancakes stacked 3 high, burgers with hand-cut fries, a coffee blend she'd labeled Dad's Sunrise Blend, in careful block letters. The first real trouble came from a supplier named Frank Dobson, a heavy-set man who had delivered fresh produce and dry goods to Marguerite's for nearly 2 decades before it closed. Marcus had called ahead, introduced himself politely, and driven 40 minutes to Dobson's warehouse to set up an account in person, the way his own father once taught him some relationships still needed a handshake rather than an email. Dobson looked him over from behind a clipboard, glanced once at the paperwork's name, and claimed supply was tight that season, that he simply lacked the inventory for a new account. Behind him, through the open warehouse door, Marcus could see pallets of produce stacked 3 high, crates of coffee beans still shrink-wrapped, far more inventory than a dozen diners could use in a month. Neither man acknowledged what was actually happening, neither needed to. I understand, Marcus said, folding the useless paperwork back into his jacket, voice level despite the tightening in his chest. He drove back to Bayside Cove with Naomi in the passenger seat, who had come along hoping to see the warehouse and now sat quietly watching the ocean pass instead of asking questions her father clearly wasn't ready to answer. The bank proved difficult in its own quiet way. Marcus sat across from a loan officer named Carol Simmons at Bayside Cove Community Bank, requesting a modest line of credit to cover the diner's remaining repairs and first month of inventory. She asked 3 separate times how he intended to maintain positive cash flow, rephrasing the question each time as though his previous answers hadn't sufficed. 2 chairs down through the glass partition, Marcus watched another prospective business owner, a white man opening a surf shop 2 blocks from the diner, get his loan approved after a single friendly question about projected summer traffic. Marcus said nothing to Carol about what he'd noticed, knowing that voicing it aloud would only get him labeled the way he'd been labeled before: difficult, aggressive, someone who saw problems that didn't exist. He signed what paperwork he could, secured a smaller loan than needed, and walked into the parking lot where Naomi waited on a bench, sketchbook closed in her lap, watching him with the stillness of a child trying to read bad news off her father's face before he spoke a word. That night, back at the apartment, Naomi unpinned the drawing of the diner's opening day menu from the refrigerator door, where it had hung for weeks, folding it carefully into the back pocket of her sketchbook instead. Marcus noticed but didn't ask why, understanding without explanation that she had begun quietly keeping score the way children do, tallying every closed door and cold shoulder even as the adults around her pretended those doors weren't closing. "Is it because we don't have enough money?" Naomi asked later, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table while he ate cold leftovers standing at the counter, "Or because of how we look?" Marcus set down his fork and looked at his daughter, 9 years old and already carrying a question most adults spend a lifetime avoiding. He wanted to lie, to tell her it was only about money, something simple and fixable, but he'd promised himself long ago never to lie to Naomi about the world she was growing up in, even when the truth weighed more than she should have to carry. "Sometimes it's both," he told her honestly, "but neither of those things says anything true about who we are. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." 2 days later, while clearing a storage cabinet beneath the diner's front counter, Marcus found a rusted tin box wedged behind a stack of old receipts. Prying it open, he discovered handwritten recipe cards in faded blue ink alongside a folded letter addressed to no one in particular. The recipes were simple: brown butter pancakes, apple pie with cinnamon, a burger sauce with exactly 7 ingredients, a coffee roasting method scrawled in the margins. The letter, signed simply Marguerite, explained she had once been offered a considerable sum to sell the diner to a development company decades earlier and had refused, believing some places were worth more open than sold, places where truck drivers and schoolteachers and widows and children could all sit at the same counter and be treated the same way. Marcus read the letter twice, sitting on an overturned milk crate with Naomi peering over his shoulder, and something settled in him that felt less like a business decision and more like an inheritance. He decided the diner would open on the day of Bayside Cove Summer Festival, using Marguerite's original recipes as the backbone of the menu, not simply to earn money but to preserve the exact spirit that letter described. 200 miles away, inside the glass-walled boardroom at Caldwell Provisions, Vanessa sat through a routine strategy meeting about the Bayside Cove expansion when one of the older board members, a man who had known her father, mentioned the previous year's contamination recall as though it were ancient history already resolved and filed away. He called it a lesson learned and moved to the next slide before Vanessa could process why the remark had unsettled her. She realized, sitting there, that she had never actually read the original incident report herself, only the summary Owen Pratt had handed her before she signed off on the termination. That night she asked her assistant to pull the archived file, telling herself it was simple due diligence, nothing more. What she found kept her awake past midnight: an email thread from Marcus dated 3 weeks before the recall warning, specifically about the contaminated grain filler, followed by a gap in the system logs exactly where his follow-up messages should have appeared. The signature approving the batch's release didn't match any version of Owen's handwriting she'd seen elsewhere. Vanessa sat with the folder open on her kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold, hearing Marcus's voice from that termination meeting as clearly as if he stood before her. "You'll have to open that email again someday." Owen Pratt had served as the company's chief operating officer for 11 years, long enough to remember exactly what had happened during the contamination scandal because he was the one who had buried it. The board had pressured him hard that season, threatening to cut his bonus and replace him if the new product line missed its launch date, and when Marcus's warning crossed his desk, Owen calculated that a delayed launch would end his career faster than a quiet mistake would. He deleted what needed deleting, forged what needed forging, and let a good man take the fall for a decision that was never his to make. When word reached him that Vanessa was quietly reopening the file, Owen moved with the urgency of a man protecting far more than his job. He called Frank Dobson, reminding him in language vague enough to avoid anything actionable that Caldwell Provisions valued long-term partners who understood the value of staying out of complicated situations. He called a contact at Bayside Cove Community Bank, framing it as a routine credit review, and within days Marcus's small line of credit was frozen pending documentation that never seemed sufficient. An anonymous complaint filed with the county building office alleged unpermitted electrical work at Marguerite's, and within a week Marcus's renovation permit was suspended pending inspection. Then came the post, appearing on the Bayside Cove Community Forum under an account with no real name attached, describing Marcus as an angry outsider trying to seize a piece of the town's history for himself, hinting without evidence that the code violations and financial troubles were only the beginning of what people should worry about. The post spread through the forum within a day, and by week's end 2 families who had promised to bring their children to the opening quietly cancelled, apologizing in text messages offering no real explanation. Naomi found the post on a shared family tablet while looking up festival dates, reading the comments beneath it before Marcus even knew it existed. That evening she sat across from him at the kitchen table, sketchbook closed and pushed aside, and asked the question that would stay with him longer than any insult a stranger had thrown his way: do they hate you because you did something wrong, or because you're you? Marcus had no answer that wouldn't break something in both of them, so he simply reached across the table and held her hand until she let the question go, at least for that night. What Naomi did next, she did without telling her father. Using markers and construction paper from her school supplies, she made a small run of flyers reading, "Marguerite's Diner is open for everyone," and the following afternoon walked 3 blocks with a roll of tape, sticking them to lamp posts and the community bulletin board outside the grocery store. Marcus found out only when a neighbor mentioned seeing his daughter out there alone, and when he confronted her, torn between fear at the risk and something close to awe, she simply shrugged and said someone had to say it if the grown-ups were too scared to. The permit suspension arrived 3 days before the scheduled opening, a letter taped to the diner's front door citing unspecified violations requiring full re-inspection before Marguerite's could legally serve food. The bank's frozen credit line meant Marcus couldn't cover the deposit a replacement supplier now demanded up front, having heard through the small-town grapevine that Marguerite's had suddenly become a risky account. Standing amid his half-finished kitchen with festival banners still rolled up in the corner, Marcus understood every closing door around him had a hand behind it, even if he couldn't yet see whose. Vanessa came to the diner that evening without the lawyer, without the assistant, carrying only a folder under her arm. She told Marcus she had found evidence in the company's own records that the signature on his termination file didn't match anything real, that she now believed him about the warnings he'd sent. Marcus looked at her standing in the doorway of the diner she had once offered to buy out from under him, and something in him refused to soften after everything the last 3 weeks had cost him and his daughter. "You're the one who signed that paper," he said, voice quiet but unmoving. "You didn't look at me once while you did it. Now you want me to believe you looked hard enough this time?" Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but he had already turned back toward the kitchen, and after a long moment she left the folder on the counter and walked back into the dark without another word. That night, after Naomi had gone up to bed, Marcus stood alone in the middle of the diner, the half-fixed neon sign still dark above the door, and began, without fully deciding to, packing tools back into a cardboard box. He wasn't sure if he meant to quit or simply needed his hands occupied with something other than shaking, but the motion felt like surrender, folding wrenches and paintbrushes into a box the same way he'd once folded 9 years of his working life into one from his old office. He heard soft footsteps on the stairs behind him and didn't turn, already knowing it was Naomi, who was supposed to be asleep an hour ago. She said nothing, simply walked over, sat on the floor beside the box, and placed her small hand flat on top of it, stopping him from adding anything more. Neither spoke for a long while, sitting together in the half-lit diner with the ocean sounding faintly through the cracked window, and it was in that silence, more than in any argument or apology, that Marcus remembered exactly why he had bought this broken building in the first place. Back in her own kitchen that same night, Vanessa faced the decision that would define the rest of her career. Owen had already called twice, warning that taking the file to the board would tank the company's stock, collapse the Bayside Cove expansion, and brand her a weak executive who let sentiment for a former employee cloud her judgment. In his second call, cornered and desperate, he let slip that the board itself had pressured him during the contamination scandal, forcing his hand in ways he'd never admitted to anyone, and Vanessa realized the rot ran further up than one man's guilt. She thought of the cardboard box she imagined sitting in that dark diner, of Marcus's voice telling her she'd have to open that email again someday, and understood that staying silent now would make her no different from the man who had built this mess in the first place. There was no version of silence that let her sleep through another year the way she'd slept through the last one. She brought the full file to the board herself 2 days later, the deleted warnings, the forged signature, Owen's system access logs showing exactly when records had been altered, and a written account of how an innocent man had been sacrificed to protect a launch deadline. For the first time in her career, Vanessa didn't hide behind her title, telling the board plainly that she had signed a termination she never properly investigated and that the company owed Marcus Webb more than an apology. Owen was suspended within the hour and referred for legal review before the meeting even ended. Caldwell Provisions issued a formal correction to Marcus's employment record, dropped its interest in acquiring Marguerite's, and began the slow work of preparing a public statement it should have made years earlier. Marcus's suspended permit was reinstated by week's end, the frozen credit line released, and Frank Dobson showed up unannounced at the diner's back door to apologize in person, offering the first delivery free, a gesture that fixed nothing but was accepted anyway. Vanessa returned to Marguerite's alone, carrying the same folder as before, and told Marcus she didn't expect forgiveness, only that he deserved to know the full truth. He read through every page at the counter while she stood quietly by the door, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had eased, not quite into peace, but into the particular relief of a man who finally saw his own story told correctly. Naomi came out from the kitchen and asked Vanessa without hesitation whether she'd be attending the opening. Marcus wasn't ready to call it forgiveness, but he didn't ask her to leave either. "I haven't forgotten what happened," he told her, "but tomorrow you can stand in line like everybody else." That wasn't peace, it was something smaller and sturdier, the first outline of justice taking shape rather than the whole finished thing. The morning of the opening, Marcus unlocked the doors of Marguerite's at sunrise, and the smell of brown butter pancakes and fresh coffee drifted over the coastal road for the first time in years. Naomi stood behind the counter, proudly explaining every item on the menu she had helped design, including the flyer she'd once taped up alone, now framed on the wall beside the door. Neighbors who had doubted him filed in one by one, some offering quiet apologies, others simply ordering breakfast as their own way of admitting they'd been wrong. The loan officer who had asked 3 suspicious questions came in for coffee and left a generous tip without a word about it. Vanessa arrived, dressed plainly, and stood in line like everyone else, and when her turn came she asked Naomi what was best on the menu. "The brown butter pancakes," Naomi said, "but my dad says everybody gets treated right before they get judged." Marcus stood behind the counter, watching his daughter speak the words he'd tried to live by his whole life, and understood he hadn't won back a title or a reputation so much as he'd won something steadier, the sight of his daughter watching her father refuse to bow, one honest morning at a time. Marguerite's became, in the months that followed, exactly what its original owner had once written about in that faded letter, a place where line cooks and schoolteachers and widows and tired travelers could sit at the same counter and be treated the same way. Marcus never got back the 9 years he'd lost at Caldwell Provisions, and he never fully forgot the sound of that pen signing his name away without a glance, but every morning he unlocked those doors, he proved something no boardroom could take from him twice, that his worth was never something anyone else had the right to decide.